I'm Stephen Sutherland, and this is Amanda Vital. Did I say that right?
Yep.
And we are presenting today Learning Analytics, Promises, Proxies, and the Path Forward, our topic and reflection for Module 6. We had some very interesting stuff going on here. The reason why we're doing this format is that in my capstone, I'm doing podcasting as the subject of my learning module. And so I thought this would be a good application of what I've been working on there for using this conversation to talk about learning analytics for this assignment. Amanda, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? What are you doing in oils and a little bit about this?
I'm Amanda Vital, and I am pursuing my master's in the oils program, fellow collaborator and podcast co host to Steven for learning analytics. I also thought this would be a great format, a little different, and a little change up from some of the other formats that we've seen in class. So we're excited to talk to you about learning analytics.
Awesome. The central question that came out of this was what has the field actually demonstrated after a decade of research? The abbreviation for this is LA, Learning Analytics. The studies that we looked at for this were the Viberg study, the Q and Tasser study, and the Molinar study that mapped out a whole bunch of research on the topics of analytics. Some of the things that came out were like the proxy problem. I want us to look at where we came from, and that really relates to the proxy problem here. We have the old model, which was a lot of session data, web developer data, stuff that a learning management system might pick up even just by default. And as we've been talking about this, we've really brought the idea out that a lot of these learning management systems were developed by developers, not by educators. And this switch to AI really brings us into a realm where educators can have the voice in what gets developed instead of relying on the old methodologies. And that moves us into kind of this new proxy situation with AI and us able to focus on what learning actually requires. A lot of this transition has to do with ethical concerns, and Amanda's going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and as Stephen mentioned, the proxy problem, it's very heavily data driven. It's based on metrics. It doesn't highlight what the learner or the student has going on in the background, which does have an influence on the ethics. And with AI joining in on learning analytics, it highlights more of the data driven conversations. So we're going to discuss more about how to include more human based reflection on what analytics can do and how the human can come in and give more context.
Absolutely. One of the things that we found in the evidence gap were a couple interesting things. One, the 9% on improved learning outcomes is a scary number because if we're doing this and we're not getting improved learning, then what are we doing? And are we measuring the right things? And then this number for 35% improved learning support, these tools have really helped with developing the teacher aspects of helping the students understand where they are and finding ways to help them improve on those gaps. Then we move into this 18% even mentioned ethics, and I'll let Amanda speak to that a little bit more.
So, a lot of the ethical risks with the learning analytics is kind of privacy and data use, bias and fairness, transparency and accountability, surveillance and autonomy. And what that looks like, a simple example is if an AI system flags students who log in less often and flags them as at risk, it might miss that some of the learners have other things going on again in the background. Maybe they're caregivers, maybe they have work requirements like we have here as graduate students. So the model kind of penalizes them, flagging them at risk without seeing the entire context.
Absolutely. And I would bring in here, I paid attention to McCluskey's theory of margin, where a student's power and their load can determine their engagement factors and their cognitive overload. And so that really plays into this, where without human interaction, we're maybe missing out on the emotional cognitive stuff. This data shows that emotional data wasn't even being considered in a lot of these studies. And what we've been talking about this morning is that the teacher interaction component becomes highly important, because how are we supposed to measure emotional data where that requires so much interpretation that it's more of the function of faculty and facilitators to help bridge that emotional cognitive gap.
And that's where you said, Stephen, the programmers, it's bias when a programmer creates these tools and these analytics to where they're creating it based on data and metrics. And that
Right.
emotional data relies very heavily on the educator's knowledge of the learner or of the student or of that greater context that could be affecting these analytics.
Absolutely. That brings us to the intervention gap. Detection, diagnosis, and action come to the forefront from the Molinar study. The field seems to be stuck in detection mode, where as we're moving forward, it really is moving into student support mode. The old model really focused on a behaviorist and a interdiction strategy that seemed a lot more punitive and not very student focused. And so what we are finding in the kind of modern iteration of this with AI is that relationships come to the forefront, learning processes come to the forefront, and student regulated learning can then start actually being engaged both by the teacher and by the way that we build our lessons. And that leads us to the human in the loop conversation that we've had in this class. And Amanda's going to talk to us a little bit more about that.
And for human in the loop, that remains very important in this context of analytics because you do need that human aspect, that critical thinking, that context for the educator to look at the numbers, but also look at the student and make a more holistic judgment. So maybe the analytics are flagging the student for missing one question multiple times on a quiz. Maybe they need to then have an intervention and do that act and come in and give more support on that subject. Why are they missing that question? But Steve and I had a previous conversation, and he has a really good different terminology for human in the loop.
Right. And so I've talked about it in some of my discussion posts. I've been calling it human interruption. And rather than just us being in the loop and passively consuming what the AI is doing, we find stop points where we actually interrupt. And in analytics and measurement of a student's performance, this is really where the human comes into play. And it's important that the faculty be engaged with their class to help with some of these factors of motivation and emotional factors in students' lives and relationships. That leads us to the blind spots. As we wrap this up, we wanted to talk a little bit more about really these key topics that are on us as we move forward as educators building new programs. First off, that's not on this list, it is the interruption of the programmer as the primary developer. And what I mean by that is, for so long, software has been developed by programmers, and they don't necessarily understand what we're trying to accomplish through our education models, through our pedagogy, through some of these new techniques and constructivist techniques that help us really engage the students in the experience. And it's on us to start looking at using these AI tools to develop new software, new engagements that the students can really strive and thrive from. Do you want to
Yeah,
talk to us
from
about ethics in this or anything else?
yeah, and like you were saying, from a designer's perspective instead of just the programmer. and maybe even more collaboration on that front, but sometimes that doesn't work out so well.
Well, we have to be on the same page, right? That's a real
Right.
problem in our discovery phase and our analysis is that if everybody's not on the same page, we might be building the same product.
And looking towards the same objective, because the designer's objective is the learning that's actually
Right.
happening.
Putting the learning objective up front instead of the technology.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, that leads into the ethics as well, too. And as you highlight there on the slide, ethics as an afterthought. And we have to look at what are the risks on ethics, like privacy, bias, transparency, and surveillance. So a lot of these play into the technology that we're using. So, will our data be private? Will it be between the learner and the teacher? Who else is going to see this data? The bias. There are some learners who don't have as much access as other ones, or even socioeconomic bias that may be in the programming. Transparency. Again, where's our data going? How is it being used to have that trust in the technology tools that we use? And then surveillance. Sometimes people feel very much Big Brother is watching when you're using some of this technology. And that also can hinder the motivation, again, of the student to work well within the whatever tool they're using.
Absolutely. Let's touch on theory fragmentation. We talk about wicked problems in this coursework, and that is one of the big problems of our industry is that the problems are very big that we're trying to solve, and so the theories tend to get fragmented over 62 different theories were evaluated in these studies, and that's a huge number, and it makes it harder for us as instructional designers to hone in on where to come from with some of this research to actuation, to actually developing based on what we've learned. And then the last point here is emotional invisibility. And we touched on this earlier. For me, it's really that's where the human element comes into play. And the AI might be able to be a good tutorial support, but it's not necessarily a great emotional supporter. We need to make sure that our designs include human interaction, as our coursework has had a lot of group work involved in it. Mentorship, more the Vygotsky realm, where we're working in zones of proximal development. And that leads us to Amanda has a real life example of AI supported error pattern learning.
Yeah. So again, keeping the human at the forefront, it's important for us to have these real life examples and these experiences because human experience is going to override technology or any analytics any day. So this is just a real life example of like a math study tool and some tips for using those analytics for the educator. So being alert, getting an alert from, again, maybe missing some of those common quiz answers, making sure to check. The educator needs to make sure that they check in with the student, responding, having an intervention, maybe sitting, having a conversation, and observation, of course. If they're making the same mistakes, then what do we need to change on the education side?
Absolutely. That leaves us with some pending questions for you all to discuss as our discussion aspect of this. If behavior data is surface level and emotional data is almost unmeasured, what are we actually learning from our analytics and how can we make them better? What are the things we should be measuring instead of what we have been measuring?
Yeah, and like number two, this does come from the readings, found prediction methods declining after 2015. Is this because prediction failed, or is because predicting failure without preventing it felt ethically uncomfortable? So those predictive models, what was behind them? What were they really predicting?
Or were we predicting anything at all? Were we just mandating the behaviors that we thought were measurable? And then finally, Molinar's best automated SRL detection hits 55% accuracy. Is that good enough to build interventions on, or does it mean we're not ready? And really, my point here is we have to get to a much better outcome percentage with AI than we're currently getting, or what are we actually outputting at the end of the day, and what is being interpreted and learned? And as these analytics and all these studies really show, there's so much potential for good encouragement and good human communication and good interactions between the data and the student that it's really our job as instructional designers to bring this data into the future reality of what we are designing for students.
Exactly. So I think the a big takeaway is as designers, we need to have clear goals and objectives for our learners, be able to guide educators with small interventions. And the most important is the human intervention.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's make sure that we are interrupting these processes and putting our eyes on it so that the students are getting the best benefit that we intended instead of necessarily what we were just anticipating. Thank you all for listening to our conversation, and thank you, Amanda. It's been great having this conversation with you. Did you
Thank
have
you.
any final things that you'd like to say?
No, it's just been great collaborating with you on this project.
Absolutely. And we hope you all enjoyed it. This discussion is open for you all as part of this, and then our presentation is in the notes. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you in class.